tree production systems in a country which is called Niger. Niger is in the West African Sahel, and you see it situated here between Nigeria and a few other countries to the north, like Libya. I'll try to go a bit quick. One of the important features of Niger is that it's the poorest country in the world, according to the Human Development Index of the UNDP. So, which tells something about the state in which Niger finds itself. It has also been, let's say, the theater, I would say, of let's say, political and economic crisis during the 1980s and 1990s. At this moment, it's become a little bit more stable politically, although since 2006 there is a Tuareg uprising, which is stimulated by the American friend, or the nowadays American friend called Mr. Gaddafi. This is the popular image of Niger, which is a country. You see images here of a woman with a child to a feeding center, and an image of a feeding center. It's a country which, according to CNN and BBC, is often confronted with famines and drought and malnourishment. These are some of the images of the 1970s and 1980s, when there were many droughts hitting the Sahel, and farmers were confronted with, let's say, with a drop in average rainfall of about 200 millimeters, which practically meant from 700 to 500 or from 600 to 400, which required substantial adaptation. Here you see some of the three research areas we had in the west, the middle, and the eastern part of the country, about 1,000 kilometers apart. Here is an image. If you look at the black dots, then each black dot represents a mature tree. And where you don't see black dots, you have basically barren land. Now, I would like to do a little quiz, in the sense that you see on the left-hand side, you see a lot of trees, and on the right-hand side, you see very few trees. Now, the question is, which year is 1975 and which year is 2003? So, who would opt for 1975 on the left-hand side? Oh dear, why don't you fall into the trap? Normally, when we present this at donor agencies, almost everybody says, yes, this is 1975. For the simple reason that what is in our mind is that the situation, the environment in the Sahel continues to degrade. And so it's logical, 75 is the year where you find very little vegetation. So here we put the years into them, and you see 1975, very few trees. And in 2003, you have 15 to 20 times more trees than in 1975, despite the fact that the villages have grown a lot. Here is literally a story of more people, more trees. What we found, what we discovered during a study which began in 2006, is that in an area of about 5 million hectares, farmers had protected and managed systematically spontaneous on-farm regeneration. And so it has nothing to do with tree planting, it has to do with protecting natural regeneration on-farm. And this is the image, one of the images of the region which is called Zinder, the southern parts of Zinder, where you have population densities of about 100 people or more on a square kilometer. You see a species here which is called Fiderbia albida, which has as a main characteristic that it produces a lot of fodder, but it's also a nitrogen-fixing tree. In this region of Zinder, we found, Gray and I discovered just by chance in February 2006, that there is about 1 million hectares of this kind of farmer-managed natural regeneration. We looked at the literature. We haven't, until now, found one single word in a scientific publication or in a report about this phenomenon. Isn't it interesting? It has just flown under the radar. It has been completely overlooked. Very difficult to explain why that is the case. Another image where you see that this tree does not compete with the crops. Now, I think Gray is taking over here because we have got to the middle part.
20 minutes each, right? Oh, just kidding. Just kidding.
But you are speaking fast.
Yeah, well, I'll be brief. Yeah, I'm Gray Tappan, U.S. Geological Survey. Worked with Chris in Burkina, Mali, and Niger for the last 7 or 8 years. So, I supported the physical geography, fieldwork, and some of the fieldwork, and let's bring it up. There we go. That's better. And the remote sensing part, so I'll start with the remote sensing part. Here we just, we used a small light aircraft and did a lot of very low-tech remote sensing, basically a camera, a GPS, and a Cessna 180. And did, for not very much expense, covered many hundreds, if not thousands of square kilometers of our study areas, getting pictures like this one. It was important to try to quantify the extent of tree cover, the impacts of those trees, and the land use practices over time. So for the current period, we did get a lot of our own aerial photos, and also these aerial photos which we mosaicked together into rather large sheets covering a village and all the farmland around it. They were really very important tools for having very rich discussions with the local people about land cover changes, natural resource changes, what were the trees like, what was the composition of the trees in the last 40, 50 years. So very, very useful. And of course, the village people can really find themselves in these photos, and they get a lot of enjoyment out of that. But also we use existing aerial photography and imagery, satellite imagery, to look at changes in this large study area, southern Niger. 1955, we see an area, this is again the very heavily settled, very densely settled agricultural area. We see a lot of fallow areas in the dark patches. The trees, of course, quite a bit of tree cover. We've lost some of the trees by 1975. Chris mentioned the droughts, as well as the pressure on those trees for firewood. But tremendous regrowth, regeneration of trees. We see much more tree cover, certainly tree density now, as we can see in that 2005 image. Interesting also to look at the villages. Same story, different area. Look at this village here. It really wasn't there in 1975, so we're seeing certainly more people along with more trees, which is an interesting juxtaposition. Another area too, we're in the area southwest of Zinder. 1975, again, had lost a lot of tree cover, and now we're just seeing tremendous regeneration. Chris will speak more about that, particularly of that acacia or Fiderbia albida tree. And we're really blessed with a lot of recent commercial satellite imagery, QuickBird, Iconus, to look at, to use as a tool for quantifying the tree cover today. This is an Iconus satellite image in that area. So we're able to quantify for a number of villages and different kinds of landscapes, tree cover, woody cover from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 2005. And in almost all cases, we're seeing tremendous increases in the woody cover. Another thing that I'm trying to do is to quantify the woody biomass in this tree cover. So we're using the foresters Biltmore stick, which gives you the height and the canopy diameter and so on. But really trying to get at woody biomass and therefore carbon. We're interested in how much carbon has been sequestered in this system since 1975. A lot, we think. So I'm trying to get at that. Here's that picture that Chris showed earlier of Galma, and we can see some of the changes. Basically 1.4 tons of carbon in the woody biomass at that time per hectare, and then 10 tons of carbon in woody biomass in 2005. So tremendous increases. Also interested in the increases in biodiversity, starting to look at that. What I've done in other parts of the Sahel, including Senegal, is to try to get pictures on the ground. This is all part of monitoring from the ground up. So pictures of landscapes, say 1983, come back 1996. Do we see change? In this case, of course, we do. A lot of pressure on the land. But in some of the on-farm areas, again, in Senegal, same kind of farming system with that Fiderbia albida tree. Even 21 years apart, you see almost no change in the mature trees. So it's amazing how slow the growth is once those trees mature. This is an area where the farmers really do not touch those trees. They're tremendously valued, and they're not cut down at all. Another example in the on-farm area in Senegal, where we're seeing the loss of fallow land, long-term fallow, and fewer trees in the fields, unlike what we see in Niger, which is quite the opposite. So role of remote sensing, certainly to quantify the changes over time, but also, as we say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We have got a tool to show policymakers, to convince the international community, local people, the planners, that something really special is happening in Niger. And the challenge is, how do we upscale, how do we replicate what's going on in Niger to other parts of the Sahel? I think this study gives us some hope that a lot can be done.
So the question is, what are the causes of this? So we asked about 400 farmers. Why have you begun protecting and managing the on-farm trees, your spontaneous regeneration? The first answer was, we had to fight the Sahara. And then they defined the Sahara. Sahara to them was not sand dunes rolling southward, but was fighting the dust and the sandstorms, which caused a lot of damage to the crops. And also the increasing population pressure. It's the Bose-Roop hypothesis. More people means that people are induced to intensify agriculture. But what was maybe most vital was the weakening of the state. Until 1985, all the trees belonged to the state. And the state weakened because of all the crises, and the farmers grabbed the space that was freed by the state. And if you ask a farmer now to who do the trees belong, they all say they are my individual property, which is vital. And also they see the multiple benefits generated by trees. What are we talking about? We are talking about 5 million hectares, which is about 12.5 million acres. And we are talking about an average of 40 trees per hectare. So we are talking about 200 million new trees over the last 20 years. The number of trees planted by projects in Niger over the same period is about 60 million trees. But of those 60 million, we had a survival rate of at most 50%, which means 30 million trees are still being left. So what farmers have done has literally dwarfed what has been done by publicly funded forestry activities. The question is, has this had any impact? Now, well, we asked the farmers, what do you regard as the most important impacts of this regreening? One of the first things they say, it's changes in the microclimate. We have less problems with the sand and the dust storms nowadays. But also, there's an increased resilience to drought. And there may even be, some say, a positive feedback on rainfall. More trees, more rainfall. Here, just to illustrate how let's say, some vegetation impacts on soil temperatures. You see 49 degrees Celsius on the right-hand side, just on the bare sand, 43 Celsius when there's just a little bit of vegetation. And on the right-hand side, you see the young millet, which is protected by some vegetation against wind-blown sand. Decrease or an increased, let's say, resilience to drought. More young people stay in the village because they can cut some trees and cut some firewood. They can do some trade, they can earn some income, which makes them stay in the village. More complex production systems and also more sustainable production systems. Just to show here an image, what we see is an integration of systematic of agriculture, forestry, and livestock. Here's some livestock which are still grazing in June on crop residues, which is at the far end of the rainy season. And you see the enormous number of trees in this village. Fodder is no longer a constraint and no longer a major constraint to livestock, which means that livestock numbers have increased. Farmers can harvest fodder also during the dry season from the trees. You see lots of products, tree-related products along the road which are for sale, so it's cash income. You see impacts on biodiversity, not everywhere. You see impacts on women in the sense that it's easier to collect firewood. There are also impacts on soil fertility and on carbon sequestration. And also a reduction in the conflicts between herders and farmers. We'll illustrate it quickly. This used to be barren land in 1985. Now have a look. You see it's what Americans, I think, call dirty farming. There is no system in it. It's just all a mix of trees, of bushes, of perennial grasses, annual grasses and crops. Women, they have gone out to collect firewood, which takes them half an hour a day on average, rather than 2.5 hours a day in the past. In Darfur, there is that tremendous conflict, as you all know, between various groups. And Ban Ki-moon wrote an interesting article in the Washington Post a few months ago. He said, this conflict was triggered by the drought of the early 1970s, which led to a contraction of the natural resource base. What we see in Niger, we do not see a contraction of the natural resource base, we see an expansion of the natural resource base. The cake is growing in some areas, not everywhere, but in some areas. It has reduced conflicts between herders and farmers by about 80%. So in economic terms, what does this mean? The 200 million trees, new trees, we estimate have an annual production value, annual, of about €1 a tree, which is an underestimation. This means that farmers get each year about 200 million euros in their pockets in the form of natural products like firewood, fodder, fruit, medicine, improved soil fertility, etc. Now, some people have said, Chris, you exaggerate. Probably this has all to do with regreening, with improved rainfall, because we see some improved rainfall in the Sahel since the middle of the 1990s. So Gray Tappan did a very interesting exercise, which we'll quickly show. Gray made a transect, you see the red dots, from southern Niger to northern Nigeria. And the conditions on both sides of the frontier are the same. In the sense, the only difference is that in northern Nigeria there is a bit more rainfall than in southern Niger, which would mean that normally you would find more trees in northern Nigeria than in southern Niger, if rainfall would be the determining factor. Now we are 19 kilometers north of the border. You see lots of trees and high population density. We are 8.5 kilometers north of the border, same situation. We now drop 1.5 kilometers south of the border. Many trees have disappeared. There are a few. We go 38 kilometers south of the border, and now you have the overview, southern Niger, northern Nigeria. It's completely the opposite of what we normally would expect. Now, what does this mean? What kind of conclusions can you draw from this? The conclusion cannot be that rainfall is not important for regreening or for farmer-managed natural regeneration. A conclusion is that there are probably that it's a social process, that social factors are more important than physical factors. It's the access rules, it's the land and the tree tenure in southern Niger, which probably play a determining role in explaining the difference. Some lessons, just a few for policymakers. Farmer-managed natural regeneration is low cost. It produces multiple impacts. It's a little bit like the stone, the single stone with which you can kill many birds. It's important for poverty reduction, but also for adaptation to climate change and sustainable development. Now the question is has this been a spontaneous process, or has there been a catalyzing effect from the outside? Yes, in certain regions, there has been a catalyzing effort from projects, NGO projects in the middle of the 1980s. In other regions, that is less evident. So you find both, and spontaneous and catalyzed by projects. Farmers invest in on-farm trees is an important lesson when they have an exclusive right to the trees on their fields. Otherwise, what is their incentive? They wouldn't have. So governments have a vital contribution to make in the whole process. Governments should lower the barriers to millions of farmers who would like to invest in their trees. And one way of doing so is to provide them maybe with incentives, but more important is to adapt national legislation, in particular the forestry laws. The forestry laws are still, let's say, very much all trees belong to the state. And they should explicitly recognize that the trees should belong and should be managed by the farmers. The government still has the idea, and the foresters in particular have the idea, that they have to protect the trees against the farmers. Whereas we feel that in most cases the trees have to be protected against the foresters. Now the question is this phenomenon in Niger, is this unique? Can you find it elsewhere? We've been traveling through the Sahel and we find many other examples of on-farm regreening. This is an example from Mali, and we feel that there are many of those successes, grassroots successes, which can be uncovered and should be documented. So there is a key challenge, I think, for research, which is to quantify the multiple impacts that are being mentioned by the farmers. And there is, I think, to development, there is the key challenge to build on existing grassroots successes, which is what we try to do. And we are currently setting up what we call the Sahel Regreening Initiative. So we are trying to move from research to action. It's time for substantive action in the Sahel. And we are composing what we would call a civil society movement, an international one as well as at national level, where NGOs but also research institutions work together to jointly try to promote farmer-managed natural regeneration, which is all about asset building, poverty reduction, increasing biodiversity, adaptation to climate change. And the point is, it's possible. We show it by building on success, which is a nice empirical approach.
You alluded both, I felt, maybe positively, maybe negatively, maybe there wasn't the quality attached, but you alluded to the effects or otherwise of plantation projects, of NGO activities. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about it, because at some points you said a lot was happening, much more than was happening as farmer-initiated activity than was happening through projects. At the same time, a lot of the responses coming from farmers sounded very much like the sort of NGO discourse after the drought as to why it would be good to plant trees and manage trees. So I wonder if that discourse sort of came into common practice, in fact, through the contacts with the international groups that were working there, or is this something you see that has been generated spontaneously? Because your final suggestion is that a whole set of the non-governmental organizations and others, many of whom were involved in the replanting trees activities immediately after the drought, these people are now going to be mobilized again to look at this regreening success. So I wonder if you could just sort of try and disentangle some of the thoughts about the role of this international involvement.
It's a very complex question and not easy to answer in a few words. It's true, if you talk nowadays with NGOs and you talk about environment, they have the Pavlov reaction. Plant trees. So also at the level of NGOs, I think major changes in their thinking have to occur, have to take place. It's interesting that it was an Australian development worker missionary in the Maradi region of Zinder in 1985 who catalyzed the process and who had so much impact. What he did simply was, he said to the farmers, it was a hunger period, he said, if you protect your on-farm trees, then I will give you food aid. So that was being done for 2 years, and farmers protected the trees on 300,000 hectares. The third year, now food aid was given, and farmers cut the trees on 150,000 hectares. But they remained on 150,000 hectares. And that's interesting because farmers quickly saw the impact, and other farmers saw it as well. Some visits were organized to see, and seeing is believing. So it quickly began spreading in that region from that particular example, which was triggered by this Australian. So that was quite important. Now, if you look at why are we emphasizing now the importance of on-farm trees and management and protection of trees by farmers? Because African heads of state have just proposed a major green wall for the Sahara initiative, which is originally was planting trees from Senegal to Djibouti over 7,000 kilometers. This is changing a little bit in content, although some heads of state are still proposing it. So we try to argue that it makes a lot more sense that farmers have already made their own version of a green wall, and it's low cost, and it's very, very much asset building, poverty reduction, much more efficient than planting a wall of trees. So that's why we are involved in this kind of policy debate. It's not the perfect answer to your question, but the beginning.
You know, on the face of it, your findings sound a lot like Tiffin and Mortimer, that famous More People, Less Erosion study in Kenya, with one significant difference. Theirs really was premised on the location right outside Nairobi. So how does urbanization, what role does it play, if any, in your findings?
Thanks for this short question. Urbanization doesn't play a role. Maybe immediately around cities like Maradi and Zinder, but essentially you find it in areas far away from these cities which have no real relationship with this. This is by farmers intensifying their production system and making more complex production systems.
Have you also observed other changes in the region, such as changes in birds or other forms of wildlife and water availability?
Farmers themselves say, for instance, with relation to water, that there is much less evaporation. So where you have open water, water stays longer in those shallow areas than used to be the case in the past. So there probably is some positive impact on that side. The density of trees is probably not so high that it will have a negative impact on groundwater levels as such, which has been discussed in papers by DFID, in research papers, that the more trees you have, the more water is being pumped and the lower the groundwater table gets. That does not yet seem to be the case in this area, but it has to be studied. Yes, there are more birds, there is more small, but maybe rabbits. Lions haven't come back. No, it's small.
You drew a very interesting contrast of Nigeria and Niger, and you referred to similar positive regreening in Mali. Is there a difference because of legal reasons, or is it that Anglophone Africa has a different role for foresters as opposed to Francophone Africa?
Well, in fact, Great Tappan, he found it just not so long ago, and we haven't been able to do any study in northern Nigeria. Unfortunately, it's something that we should do. So we can't give a real good answer to your question.
And then James. Okay, James, you go first. The same as what I was going to say.
Yeah, I was just looking at the timing of the planting, and it's interesting because, of course, in the late 80s, early 90s, that is when actually on-farm forestry was the big thing. Social forestry, agroforestry. It was then very quickly abandoned because of the impact it had. Well, land was lost, men were doing it, and so it was very quickly abandoned. So, there's an interesting kind of historical context too, because the timing seems to be...
Emmanuel, thank you for this question. Both of you, we are Dutch, and so I can refer to... we are double Dutch. So we can refer to a failed Dutch social forestry project in the Sahel, which wanted to promote village forestry, and you know it because it was considered to be communal, which means that the worst lands were allocated to it. There was no clarity about to whom the trees belonged, so it was quite an abysmal failure. So this is not about planting trees, this is about something very simple: protect and manage natural regeneration, which grows spontaneously on your fields. It's the cheapest way forward and the most effective way.
I suppose it's a fascinating paper, and thanks very much. The two questions: the protected natural regeneration. Presumably the change in rainfall has enabled the natural regeneration itself to kick in and then to be protected. But the question goes, after the droughts, was there a change also in the domestic animal situation, where there, as it were, less goats around? Mm-hmm. Was it easier to protect? And I suppose to sort of look at the interaction with that part of the economy.
Yeah. Thank you, James. With regard to the rainfall, the whole process began well before the small increase in rainfall, which began in the middle of the 1980s, middle of the 1990s. This process began in the middle of the 1980s already, so well before an increase. Yes, in 1984-85 there was a livestock, total numbers had been reduced, there had been a big livestock mortality, but in this whole process of having more trees, having more fodder, there has been a build-up of the total livestock numbers. And people have more livestock now than they had probably before the drought of the middle of the 1980s. But they are able to feed them better than they were able in those days. Now, I don't want to suggest that Niger has become paradise. No, there are still major problems. And, but at least it's interesting that there has been a positive development which has largely flown under the radar. Policymakers don't want to hear about it, is my experience. For the simple reason, there's still that idea that you have to come with doom and gloom stories in order to mobilize funding. So some of the policymakers hate this story when you start arguing, but we have good hard evidence that there is this transformation, which may be Africa's most significant positive environmental transformation in an area where nobody had expected it. Researchers, where have you been for such a long time? Why has this been identified so late? There were of course, some publications which said, yes, there is a little bit here and there. Mortimer in Maradi region, for instance, he said there is some the number of on-farm trees has increased, but nobody had a clue about the dimensions until Gray began looking at the satellite images and the aerial photos.